All right, everyone loves talking about June 6th, 1944, the beaches, the boats, the bravery. And look, that day mattered. It really did. But if you actually sit down and trace the full arc of why Nazi Germany ended up completely and utterly destroyed by May of 1945, you'll find that D-Day was more like the last chapter of a book that had already been written 3 years earlier, and the real reasons Hitler lost were baked into decisions he made long before a single Allied soldier hit the sand at Normandy. Let's start with the one decision that, in the opinion of basically every serious historian alive, sealed the deal before anyone even started printing maps of the French coastline. June 22nd, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. Hitler decides to invade the Soviet Union, which on paper sounds like a bold military move, and in practice was one of the single greatest strategic miscalculations in the history of organised warfare, because the entire plan rested on a 3-month knockout punch. The idea that the Soviet state was so ideologically hollow, so structurally rotten, that it would simply collapse the moment German boots crossed the border. Hitler's exact words, by the way, were that all we have to do is kick the door in and the whole rotten edifice will come crumbling down. Bold claims, not really accurate. And then on December 6th, 1941, the Soviets launched a massive counter-offensive at the gates of Moscow using fresh Siberian divisions, actual winter-trained soldiers with winter camouflage and weapons designed to function in extreme cold, because Soviet intelligence had confirmed that Japan was not going to attack from the east, freeing up those divisions entirely, and the Germans, frostbitten and exhausted and completely caught off guard, were pushed back, and that right there was the end of Barbarossa as a viable strategy. The war in the east didn't end. It dragged on for another 3.5 years, but the dream of a quick Soviet collapse died in the snow outside Moscow in December 1941, and it never came back. Now here's something that doesn't get talked about enough when you're listing reasons Germany lost. The economics of this thing were simply never going to go Hitler's way once the conflict extended beyond a short campaign, because the United States GDP alone was already larger than all the Axis powers combined, and that's before you factor in Soviet industrial output or British production, meaning that in a prolonged war of attrition, which is exactly what the Eastern Front became, Germany was always going to run out of stuff before the Allies did. Oil, steel, food, aircraft fuel, all of it. Chronic shortages were biting into German operational capacity as early as 1942, and by 1944, Allied strategic bombing campaigns were dismantling the German war economy piece by piece. Factories, rail, lines, refineries, and the loss of Romanian oil fields at Ploiești that same year meant the Luftwaffe and the Panzer divisions were increasingly unable to operate at full capacity for lack of fuel, which is a fairly significant problem when your entire military doctrine is built around fast-moving mechanized warfare. And speaking of strategic decision-making, December 11th, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler personally declares war on the United States in a speech to the Reichstag. Germany was under absolutely no treaty obligation to do this. Japan had attacked America, not the other way around, and the Tripartite Pact only required Germany to defend Japan if Japan was attacked, not join Japan's offensive wars. And yet there Hitler is, at the podium, voluntarily handing Roosevelt the political cover he needed to enter the European theatre, which he had been trying to do for 2 years. The reasons historians give for why Hitler did this range from underestimating American military capacity to simply wanting to appear decisive. But whatever the reason, the result was that the industrial and military power of the United States, the country with the largest GDP on earth, was now formally committed to destroying Nazi Germany, and that was not a recoverable situation. Now let's talk about something that genuinely should have been an advantage for Germany, and became the opposite because of ideology. When the Wehrmacht rolled into Soviet-occupied Ukraine and the Baltic states in the summer of 1941, a substantial portion of the local population initially welcomed them, And I mean literally brought food to the advancing soldiers, because these were people who had lived under Stalin's collectivization campaigns, the Holodomor, the Great Purge, the deportations, and they genuinely believed German occupation might be better. And if Hitler had any geopolitical sense whatsoever, he would have exploited that sentiment ruthlessly, turned those populations into partisan allies behind Soviet lines, and fundamentally complicated Soviet logistics and communication across an enormous front. Instead, Nazi racial ideology classified Slavic peoples as Untermenschen, subhumans, and German occupation policy became one of mass executions, forced labour, starvation rations, and collective punishment, which predictably turned every village and forest in Eastern Europe into a source of Soviet partisan resistance rather than collaboration. Bold strategy, not really effective. By 1943, the trajectory of the war was essentially fixed, and Stalingrad had made it visible to everyone with functioning eyes. The Wehrmacht had committed the Sixth Army, roughly 300,000 men, under Field Marshal Paulus, to the capture of a city on the Volga that Hitler had decided was symbolically important, partly because it bore Stalin's name. And when Soviet forces encircled that army in November 1942 in Operation Uranus, Hitler refused to allow a breakout, refused to allow surrender, and the result was the destruction of an entire German field army, with roughly 91,000 survivors marching into Soviet captivity in February 1943, of whom only about 5,000 would ever return to Germany. After Stalingrad, Germany never successfully held the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front again, and the arithmetic of the war, Soviet production, Soviet manpower, Soviet territorial depth, ground the Wehrmacht back westward, kilometre by kilometre, for the next 2 years. And then there's the question of Hitler's relationship with his own generals, which by the middle years of the war had become something between a hostage situation and a slow-motion breakdown. Because Hitler had started the war taking credit for the early successes of men like Guderian and Manstein and Rommel, and then as the situation deteriorated, he began overriding their operational recommendations with increasing frequency, demanding offensives that made no logistical sense, refusing to authorize strategic retreats that might have preserved forces for later counterattacks, and eventually issuing orders from his bunker in East Prussia based on maps that no longer corresponded to reality on the ground. His generals could see what was happening. Some of them tried to do something about it. The July 20th plot in 1944, the bomb in the briefing room at Wolfschanze, Klaus von Stauffenberg, and the officers who backed him. And when that failed and the reprisals came, the last organized internal resistance to Hitler's command decisions was finished, and the German military machine spent its final months being directed by a man who was increasingly unwilling to hear any information that contradicted his preferred version of events. So by the time you get to June 1944 and the landings at Normandy, Germany is already fighting a massive Soviet offensive in the east, already hemorrhaging oil and steel, and trained pilots, already occupying a defensive posture. It entered reluctantly after years of failed offensive operations, and already being strategically directed by a leadership that had burned through whatever reserves of rational decision-making it might once have had. D-Day opened a second major front, yes, and that mattered, but the idea that Normandy alone broke Germany misses the fact that the Eastern Front had already consumed the majority of German military capability. Over 80% of all Wehrmacht combat operations during the entire Second World War took place on the Eastern Front, and the numbers bear this out in ways that are almost difficult to process. Roughly 30 million Soviet citizens dead, thousands of armoured battles, the largest artillery bombardments in history, and a German military that arrived at the beaches of Normandy already bled dry. The honest version of why Hitler lost isn't one decision, or one battle, or one beach. It's the accumulation of an ideology that produced bad military judgment, a strategic situation Germany never had the industrial base to sustain. An invasion of a country far more resilient than anyone in the German high command was willing to admit. And a commander who became more isolated from reality the worse things got, all colliding simultaneously with the combined economic and military output of the Soviet Union, the United States, and the British Empire. D-Day was the final act. The play was already over.